An airstrike near Ukraine's border with Poland yesterday killed 35 and injured 134 others, according to Ukrainian officials. With such strikes getting closer to NATO territory, what is NATO's next move? Let's ask Professor Alexander Lanoszka, who's Assistant Professor at the University of Waterloo and Associate Fellow in Euro-Atlantic Geopolitics at the Council on Geostrategy and expert in NATO. Evening, Alexander. I just wonder how much NATO baiting from Putin can NATO take?
Well, to be sure, the cruise missile strikes landed within Ukraine territory. And in some respects, it does not matter if the cruise missiles hit targets a few meters away from the border or many, many kilometers away from it. It is in Ukrainian territory. And so from NATO's perspective, not too much changes. It does, of course, demonstrate Russia's willingness to strike targets near the Polish-Ukrainian border, but that in itself does not necessarily precipitate any NATO response.
How close do they have to get before it does precipitate a NATO response? That's the key question, isn't it? What happens if it's a mile from a border? What happens if it encroaches a border?
I think it has to be across the border for it to precipitate a response. And even there, it's not entirely clear what will happen. So one can easily imagine a situation where a cruise missile flies away from its planned trajectory and hits Polish territory, but that could be chalked up to error. That still leaves room for both sides to try to de-escalate the situation. It does not necessarily mean that nuclear warheads are going to be mounted and thrown Russia's direction. It would certainly mean a crisis of sorts, one that's far more significant than what we've seen already. But it still means that there's a lot of room to play, for better or for worse, for NATO to react.
What ranges of actions, I suppose, I want to ask you, are open to NATO to respond without escalation?
In this particular instance, I don't think there's too much to do. Obviously, it should continue signaling that NATO territory is sacred to the extent that an attack against it done deliberately would precipitate a massive response that would be extraordinarily costly for Putin and his regime. I think the shipment of weapons should continue. And indeed, I think Russia will find it very difficult to interdict those shipments. After all, the strikes that we have seen the last few days in the area of Lviv were done by long-range aviation. Those are assets that Russia has been very reluctant to use precisely because it does not have airspace supremacy. And precisely because it lacks airspace supremacy, it does not want to see bombers or fighter jets shot down. Those are expensive assets. And indeed, Russia does not even have the network or intelligence capabilities to detect where the shipments are going and how they're coming and at what times. That is extraordinarily demanding. And so the strike that we did see from Russia is obviously significant. People did die. But I think also really just has a political significance insofar as it demonstrates that Russia is willing to use military force as close as it has to the Polish-Ukrainian border.
Thank you for talking to us tonight, Professor Alexander Lanoszka, Assistant Professor at the University of Waterloo and Associate Fellow in Euro-Atlantic Geopolitics at the Council on Geostrategy.